Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the lights, settling into that perfect pillow nest, and letting our minds drift back in time, far, far away from your buzzing phone and that ever-present to-do list. Imagine, if you will, the soft glow of oil lamps, flickering in a vast desert city. You can almost smell the exotic spices mingling with the dust, hear the low murmur of voices, a rhythm of life unfolding under a canopy of countless stars. Tonight, we're journeying to a place of unparalleled knowledge, and paradoxically, a place where the very act of preserving that knowledge became an epic struggle. We're talking about Timbuktu, a city synonymous with mystery and gold, but more importantly, with books, millions of them, handwritten, bound, and revered. And here's your friendly reality check. You probably won't survive this journey awake. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying there, feeling the soft rustle of your sheets, perhaps the distant hum of traffic. But close your eyes, and you're no longer in your modern bedroom. You're standing on the parched earth of ancient Egypt, millennia before the bustling markets of Timbuktu ever graced the desert landscape. You're watching a craftsman, his hands stained a deep, earthy red, meticulously grinding something in a stone mortar. This, my friend, is where our story truly begins, with the humble beginnings of ink. Not the sleek, factory-produced ink of your ballpoint pen, but a living, breathing substance born from the very ground beneath your feet. Think about it. How do you even start to record thoughts, stories, laws, or the price of grain without a way to make a mark that lasts? For millennia, before paper and pens as we know them, humanity scratched, carved, and painted. But for portable, flexible record-keeping, something more fluid was needed. And the Egyptians, always ahead of their time, were among the first to crack the code. They weren't just building pyramids, they were innovating in the stationery department. Their ink wasn't some complex chemical concoction. It was beautifully, elegantly simple. They mostly used carbon black ink derived from soot, like the stuff that collects in your fireplace chimney after a cozy winter night. They'd collect this soot, mix it with a plant-based gum arabica, sticky, clear resin from the acacia tree, often still used in modern watercolors, then add a bit of water. Voila, instant, remarkably durable black ink. It was so good, in fact, that you can still read hieroglyphs written with it thousands of years ago. Imagine your grocery list lasting that long. But it wasn't just the Egyptians playing with soot. Travel west, across the vast Sahara, and you'd find different civilizations, different methods. In ancient China, simultaneously, they were perfecting their own carbon-based inks, often using pine soot and animal glue, pressing it into solid sticks that you'd grind with water just before use. It was an art form in itself, often imbued with spiritual significance. You'd find similar innovations in India, where lamp black ink derived from the soot of oil lamps was a staple. Each culture, driven by the same fundamental need to record, to remember, to pass on knowledge, stumbled upon variations of the same core principle. Burn something, collect the black bits, add a binder, and write. It's like the ancient world's DIY kit for preserving thoughts. Now, while carbon black was the rock star of early inks, it wasn't the only show in town. For those vibrant reds and blues you see in ancient manuscripts, other ingredients were needed. Red ink, often used for headings or significant words, frequently came from ochre, a naturally occurring clay pigment, rich in iron oxides, or even ground-up minerals like cinnabar. Blue, that often involved precious lapis lazuli, or, more commonly, plant dyes like indigo. Imagine the sheer effort. You're not just popping down to the art supply store. You're trekking to mines, grinding minerals by hand, or carefully extracting pigments from plants. It was a serious commitment to the craft. Historians still argue whether the concept of recipes for these early inks were widely shared or developed independently across different cultures. Was there some ancient network of ink makers exchanging trade secrets? Or did each civilization simply arrive at similar solutions through trial and error? It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? Did an Egyptian scribe ever wonder how his Chinese counterpart made their ink flow so smoothly? Probably not. They were too busy trying to decipher the boss's messy hieroglyphs. The tools of writing evolved right alongside the inks. In Egypt, you'd use a reed pen cut from a hollow reed, sharpened to a fine point, or even frayed at the end. Like a tiny brush, dipping it into a little pot of ink, you'd meticulously etch your symbols onto papyrus, a material made from the pith of the papyrus plant, laid out in strips, pressed and dried. Papyrus was revolutionary, a lightweight, flexible writing surface that allowed for the creation of scrolls, long narratives that could be rolled up and transported. Imagine trying to carry a library of stone tablets, not exactly ergonomic. For your commute, then came parchment and vellum, made from animal skins, sheep, goat, or calf. These were even more durable than papyrus, offering a smoother surface for finer detail. But they were also incredibly expensive. Think about it. You need to kill an animal, carefully prepare its hide, stretch it, scrape it, and dry it to create a single sheet for writing. It's no wonder that books on parchment were treasures, literally made from the very fabric of life. The ink had to be perfect because you really didn't want to mess up on such a costly canvas. A smudge on papyrus, annoying. A smudge on vellum, potentially a week's worth of work down the drain. Not to mention a very unhappy goat. So, by the time we fast forward to the medieval period, the process of ink making and manuscript creation was well established, refined over thousands of years. It wasn't just about putting black on white. It was an intricate dance between natural materials, skillful hands, and a profound respect for the written word. These early inks, these simple mixtures of soot and binder, or ground minerals and gum, laid the groundwork for everything that came after. They were the silent witnesses to the birth of philosophy, the recording of empires, the crafting of epic poems, and the preservation of religious texts. Without them, our understanding of the ancient world would be as blank as an uninked scroll. You're not just learning about old ink. You're tracing the very lineage of human thought, and it all sets the stage for the next act, when these venerable traditions meet their dazzling, almost unbelievable zenith in a city far, far away, nestled on the edge of the desert, where knowledge was more precious than gold itself. Now, Shift your focus from those ancient Egyptian workshops and the painstaking preparation of animal hides. Feel the warm desert breeze on your face. Taste the fine grains of sand that seem to get everywhere, and listen for the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. You're no longer in the Fertile Crescent or the misty mountains of ancient China. You've traveled south, deep into the heart of West Africa, to a city that, for centuries, existed more as a whispered legend in European minds than a tangible place. You've arrived at Timbuktu's scholarly zenith. Imagine the year is 1450. You're standing at the edge of the Niger River, where the vast ochre expanse of the Sahara Desert meets the life-giving artery of the river. Before you rises Timbuktu, not just a city, but a glittering mirage of mud brick architecture, sprawling markets, and, most importantly, countless mosques and madrasic centers of learning. This wasn't just a trading post. It was a metropolitan hub of intellectual activity, a Silicon Valley of scrolls, if you will, but with camels instead of TESLAS. At its peak. Timbuktu was part of the powerful Mali Empire, and later the Songhai Empire, both renowned for their wealth. Much of it derived from the trans-Saharan trade in gold, salt, and unfortunately, slaves. But alongside these valuable commodities, something else of immense worth flowed into and out of Timbuktu: knowledge. Books, manuscripts, and the scholarly traditions they embodied were just as valuable, if not more so, than the gleaming gold. Dust. Merchants would pay exorbitant prices for well-copied texts, some even valuing a rare manuscript more than a full sack of gold. Imagine that. A text message today rarely gets that kind of appreciation. The city was strategically located at the crossroads of two vital trade routes: the trans-Saharan routes, connecting it to North Africa and beyond, and the Niger River, which linked it to the diverse regions of West Africa. This meant a constant influx of ideas, people, and, crucially, scholarly works. Scholars from across the Islamic world, from Cairo to Cordoba, gravitated towards Timbuktu, drawn by its reputation as a beacon of Islamic scholarship. It became home to an astounding number of libraries, both public and private. It's estimated that at its height, Timbuktu housed between 400,000 and 700,000 manuscripts. Some even claim numbers as high as 1,000,000. To put that in perspective, the famous Library of Alexandria, in its prime, might have held around 500,000 scrolls. Timbuktu was, in many ways, its intellectual successor, thriving centuries later. The intellectual life of Timbuktu wasn't confined to a single grand library. It was decentralized. Every major mosque had its own collection. Scholars maintained vast private libraries in their homes, and even wealthy merchants amassed impressive collections. You could stroll through the winding alleys and hear debates on theology, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, and history spilling out from open doorways. It was an academic beehive, buzzing with intellectual curiosity. The University of Sankar, along with the equally important Jingerbur and Sidi Yahya mosques, served as the primary educational institutions. These weren't universities in the modern sense with lecture halls and student IDs. They were networks of scholars, teaching circles, and vibrant intellectual communities where knowledge was passed down from master to student. Consider the daily rhythm of such a place. The muezzin's call to prayer would echo over the rooftops, 5 times a day. But in between those calls, the city was alive with the rustle of parchment, the scratch of reed pens, and the murmur of recitation. Scholars, often working in dimly lit rooms, would pore over texts for hours, meticulously copying, annotating, and debating. The intellectual pursuit was not just a profession. It was a way of life, deeply intertwined with faith and commerce. Think of it as a historical equivalent of today's internet, a vast network of interconnected knowledge, only infinitely slower and far more beautiful to behold. The subjects studied were incredibly diverse. While Islamic theology and law formed the core curriculum, there was also a strong emphasis on secular sciences. Astronomy was particularly important for navigation and determining prayer times. Mathematics was essential for trade and architecture. Medicine, literature, history, and even botany were all subjects of intense study. You could find texts on anything from surgical procedures to the properties of desert plants, from detailed genealogies of local rulers to lyrical poetry. This wasn't a narrow, insular scholarship. It was broad, encompassing, and deeply engaged with the world around it. One of the quirky tidbits about Timbuktu's scholarly environment was the importance placed on memorization. While writing was paramount for preservation, the oral tradition remained incredibly strong. Students were expected to commit vast amounts of text to memory, often reciting entire books aloud. Imagine memorizing an entire encyclopedia just for your exams. Your brain would feel like a library in itself, constantly cross-referencing information. This wasn't just rote learning. It was seen as a way to internalize knowledge, to make it part of oneself, a living library within each scholar. It also provided a vital backup system in case, say, a fire broke out in a library, or, as we will discover, something even more fundamental went wrong. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's golden age of scholarship truly declined due to external factors, like the Moroccan invasion in 1591, or if internal shifts in focus played a larger role. Some suggest that the emphasis on Islamic jurisprudence became increasingly dominant, perhaps at the expense of other sciences, making the intellectual landscape less diverse over time. Others point to the disruption of trade routes and the general instability that followed the collapse of the Songhai Empire as the primary culprits. But what is undeniable is that for a significant period, Timbuktu shone brightly as a global center of learning. This intellectual effervescence, however, created a unique demand for the tools of the trade. With hundreds of thousands of manuscripts being produced, copied, and consumed, the need for writing materials was immense. Think of the sheer volume of reed pens being sharpened, the papyrus and parchment being prepared, and, crucially, the rivers of ink flowing from countless inkwells. The scribes, the unsung heroes of this intellectual boom, were constantly at work, their hands stained, their eyes weary, but their spirits fueled by the desire to preserve and propagate knowledge. Their efforts were the very engine of Timbuktu's scholarly zenith, and it is their efforts, their dependence on that simple, vital liquid, that will lead us to the story of what happens when the seemingly endless flow of a necessary resource suddenly, unexpectedly, begins to dry up. You can almost feel the collective intake of breath, the first tremor of an impending crisis. As the whispers of dwindling supplies begin to circulate through the bustling markets and quiet libraries, you're no longer merely an observer. You're stepping into the sun-drenched, dust-mote-filled chambers of Timbuktu. The air is thick with the scent of old paper, a faint hint of musk, and the undeniable aroma of human effort. Your fingers, if you could truly feel them, would be stained with the faint, persistent smudges of carbon. You are experiencing the scribe's daily grind. This isn't the romanticized image of a lone scholar, quill in hand, bathed in ethereal light. This is work, hard work, meticulous, repetitive, and profoundly important work. Imagine waking before dawn, the desert air still cool, with the faint call to prayer echoing from the Jingerbur Mosque. As a scribe in Timbuktu, your day isn't dictated by a punch clock, but by the relentless demand for knowledge. You might be an independent copyist, working for a wealthy merchant, eager to expand his private library, or perhaps employed by one of the great universities, tasked with reproducing a rare medical treatise. Either way, your workspace is simple: a low table or a comfortable cushion on the floor. Your back aching before the sun has even fully risen. Before you, meticulously prepared, lies your writing surface. If you're lucky, it's a sheet of fine parchment, smooth and pale, ready to receive the ink. More often, it might be a less refined piece of papyrus, or even, for everyday notes and drafts, a wooden slate, which can be washed clean and reused, the ancient world's equivalent of a whiteboard. Beside it, your tools: a sharpened reed pen, a small ceramic or metal inkwell, and perhaps a pumice stone for smoothing rough spots on the parchment, or a sharp knife for corrections. Yes, corrections. Imagine making a mistake and having to carefully scrape away the ink with a blade without tearing the precious surface. It's enough to make you write in a permanent state of high anxiety. Your first task is often to prepare your ink. Even if you don't make it from scratch every day, the solid cakes of ink would need to be ground with a little water in a small mortar, transforming them into a workable liquid. You're aiming for the perfect consistency, not too thin, or it'll bleed through the page, not too thick, or it'll clog your pen and clump on the surface. It's a delicate balance, a quiet alchemy performed at the start of each day. You might add a tiny drop of gum arabic to ensure it adheres properly, or perhaps a secret ingredient passed down through generations of scribes to give it a particular sheen or flow. Then, the main event: copying. You're not just transcribing, you're an artist and an archivist. Before you lies the master copy, the text you are to reproduce. You must copy it precisely, every word, every letter, every diacritical mark. Your hand moves with a practiced rhythm, the reed pen scratching softly against the surface. It's a sound that would have filled countless rooms across Timbuktu, a symphony of scholarship. You're not just writing, you're recreating, and every stroke is a commitment. There's no undo button here, no backspace. We're significant. Hours spent over a manuscript, straining your eyes in dim light, your hand cramping, your back aching. Scribes developed specific calligraphic styles, each script beautiful and precise. Arabic script, with its flowing lines and intricate ligatures, required immense discipline and skill. Think of the dexterity needed, not just to form the letters, but to maintain consistent spacing, straight lines, often lightly ruled in pencil beforehand, and uniform ink flow. It was an exercise in extreme patience and precision. You weren't just writing. You were performing a kind of sacred duty, preserving the words of the prophets, the wisdom of philosophers, the discoveries of astronomers. A typical day might see you copying several folios pages, depending on the complexity of the text and the fineness of the script. Some scribes specialized in particular subjects or styles. Others were generalists, capable of copying anything from a Quran to a treatise on medicinal herbs. The demand was high, and competition, while perhaps not cutthroat, certainly existed. Your reputation as a scribe depended entirely on the accuracy and beauty of your work. One historical fact that underscores this: many manuscripts contain colophons, short notes at the end where the scribe would identify themselves, the date of completion, and sometimes even offer a prayer or a humble apology for any errors. It was their signature, their brand, their proof of effort. One quirky tidbit about these scribes is their ingenious use of corrector fluid, not the whiteout we know, but often a mixture of chalk or gypsum mixed with water, applied meticulously, with a fine brush to cover mistakes, or, as mentioned, the careful scraping with a knife. Imagine the pressure, knowing that a single slip could mean hours of extra work just to fix one tiny error. It probably led to many frustrated sighs, quietly muttered curses, and perhaps even the occasional spilled inkwell in a moment of despair. The sheer volume of work meant that scribes were constantly replenishing their inkwells. A dedicated scribe could go through a significant amount of ink in a week, perhaps even in a single day if working on a large project. This wasn't a problem when supplies were plentiful, when the ingredients flowed into Timbuktu with the same ease as gold and salt. But as we know, even the most abundant resources can become scarce. Historians still argue whether the high demand for manuscripts in Timbuktu led to a decline in quality for some texts over time. While the most important works were copied with utmost care, the pressure to produce a large volume might have, in some cases, led to more rushed copies with errors. This is a common debate in the history of publishing. Long before the printing press was quantity, sometimes prioritized over absolute fidelity. It's a bit like asking if today's quick social media posts are as thoroughly fact-checked as a meticulously researched academic paper. The scribes themselves were not monolithic. Some were highly educated scholars in their own right, capable of not just copying but also commenting on and interpreting the texts. Others might have been more akin to professional copyists, their skill lying primarily in their penmanship and accuracy. Yet all played a vital role in the preservation and dissemination of knowledge. They were the human hard drives of their era, the data entry specialists, the unsung heroes who ensured that the intellectual legacy of Timbuktu would survive, even if only in fragments. As you spend your imaginary day with a Timbuktu scribe, you feel the ache in their wrist, the strain in their eyes, the satisfaction of a perfectly formed letter. You understand that this isn't just about writing. It's about the very act of preserving civilization. And as the sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the courtyard, you also feel a growing unease. The constant need for ink, the seemingly endless flow of this crucial liquid, now feels like a precarious reliance. What happens when the well starts to run dry? What happens when the raw materials, so diligently sought, and carefully prepared, become harder and harder to find. The whisper of such a thought, no doubt, occasionally crossed the minds of those tired, ink-stained scribes as they capped their inkwells for the night. The stability of their entire intellectual world depended on a steady supply of this black, unassuming liquid. As the sun begins its slow descent over the Sahara, casting long purple shadows across the desert, you find yourself shifting from the scribe's stool to a more adventurous role. Tonight, you're joining the silent, tireless network that supplied Timbuktu's insatiable hunger for knowledge. You are embarking on the quest for raw materials. This wasn't a casual trip to the local stationery store. This was a logistical marathon, an intricate dance of trade routes, natural resources, and immense human effort, all to gather the seemingly humble ingredients that made ink flow. Remember, the primary black ink used in Timbuktu, like much of the ancient world, was carbon-based. This meant sourcing soot or lamp black. Where did this soot come from? Not from the gentle flicker of oil lamps in a scholar's study. No, this was industrial scale. Soot production. Imagine large, specialized kilns or chambers where various organic materials, often wood, specific types of resinous plants, or even animal bones, were burned in a loxygen environment. This incomplete combustion produced a fine, powdery black residue, the lamp black. The quality of the soot mattered, too. Soot from different sources would yield different shades and textures of ink. It was a messy, labor-intensive process, likely carried out on the outskirts of towns or in designated areas to avoid choking the population with smoke. But soot alone wasn't enough. You needed a binder, something to make the carbon particles suspend in water and adhere to the writing surface without flaking off once dry. The universal answer for centuries, from Egypt to Timbuktu, was gum arabic. This sticky, translucent resin exudes naturally from the acacia tree, which, thankfully, is native to the Sahel region, the semi-arid belt just south of the Sahara, where Timbuktu is situated. Yet, native doesn't mean on your doorstep. Collecting gum arabic involved sending out teams to tap the trees, meticulously gather the hardened sap, and then transport it, often over considerable distances, back to the city. It's a bit like harvesting maple syrup, but with more sand and fewer pancakes. The quality of gum arabic varied wildly. The best gum was clear and pure, dissolving easily into a smooth, consistent binder. Poorer quality gum might be darker, contain impurities, and lead to lumpy, uneven ink. So, those involved in gum collection weren't just gathering, they were discerning, selecting the best specimens, knowing that the final quality of a precious manuscript depended on it. And then there was the liquid component. Water. Seems simple, right? Not in the Sahara. Timbuktu was blessed by its proximity to the Niger River, but even that mighty river could fluctuate with the seasons. Fresh, clean water was a precious commodity, not just for drinking and agriculture, but for all crafts, including ink making. You couldn't just use any stagnant pond water. Impurities would ruin the ink. So, sourcing clean water, transporting it, and storing it for the ink makers was yet another logistical hurdle, especially during the dry season. 4 colored inks, the complexity multiplied. While black was the workhorse, red, and sometimes blue, were essential for illumination, headings, or emphasis in important texts. Red ink often came from mineral pigments like red ochre, iron oxide, which had to be mined and then laboriously ground into a fine powder, or perhaps more exotically, from certain insects or plant dyes. Imagine the painstaking process of harvesting thousands of tiny cochineal insects to produce a vibrant crimson. It makes your head spin just thinking about it. The transportation of these raw materials was a feat in itself. The Sahara, while vast and unforgiving, was crisscrossed by ancient trade routes. Camel caravans, the ships of the desert, were the lifeblood of this commerce. These weren't just a few camels. These were often hundreds, sometimes thousands, of camels laden with goods, trudging slowly but relentlessly across the dunes. The journey could take weeks, even months, fraught with dangers, sandstorms, bandits, and the ever-present threat of running out of water. Think about the human chain involved. There were the prospectors, who knew where to find the best clay for ochre, the gatherers who tapped the acacia trees for gum, the workers who tended the soot-producing kilns, and then, crucially, the caravan leaders and their teams who navigated the vast, shifting sands. Each link in this chain was vital. If one link broke, the supply of raw materials would falter. It was a finely tuned ecosystem of supply and demand, all revolving around the seemingly simple act of writing. 1. MAINSTREAM. Historical fact to consider. The trans-Saharan trade routes were not just conduits for goods, they were also vital arteries for the spread of ideas, technologies, and, of course, scholarly materials. The very existence of Timbuktu as a scholarly hub was predicated on these routes, bringing in not just the raw materials for ink, but also new texts, new scholars, and new intellectual currents. The caravan bringing in a fresh batch of gum Arabic might also be carrying a new commentary on Islamic law from Cairo, or a treatise on astronomy from Baghdad. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some accounts suggest that specific types of dung from desert animals were occasionally experimented with as a source of carbon black for ink, especially in times of scarcity or for less formal writing. While not a primary ingredient, it speaks to the resourcefulness born out of necessity. Imagine the odor of a scholarly text, not of old paper and dust, but of, well, you get the idea. Thankfully, this was likely a fringe practice and not mainstream. For quality manuscripts, historians still argue whether the trade networks that supplied Timbuktu were primarily driven by local entrepreneurs and communities, or if larger, more centralized powers exerted significant control over the flow of these crucial raw materials. Was it a grassroots effort of countless individuals, or were powerful guilds or even the empires themselves orchestrating the supply chain? This debate speaks to the broader question of economic control and autonomy in colonial West Africa. The sheer volume of material needed was staggering. With hundreds of thousands of manuscripts in circulation and new ones constantly being copied, the demand for ink ingredients was relentless. It meant that every part of the ink-making supply chain, from the remote acacia groves to the dusty kilns, had to operate with incredible efficiency and consistency. The lifeblood of Timbuktu's intellectual endeavors flowed through the veins of these trade routes and the hands of countless unsung laborers as you conclude your imaginary journey. Across the sands, you realize that the ink in a scribe's well wasn't just a simple liquid. It was the culmination of arduous journeys, careful collection, and meticulous preparation. It was the distilled essence of the desert, brought to life through human ingenuity. And in the steady flow of these materials lay the quiet confidence of Timbuktu's scholars. They never had to worry about running out of ink until, of course, they did. The very efficiency and seamlessness of this supply chain made the eventual disruption all the more shocking, and the whispers of a dwindling supply all the more terrifying. The gears of knowledge production, once so well oiled, were about to grind to a halt. You're back in Timbuktu, but not in the quiet, meditative space of a scribe's study or the bustling noise of the market. Now you're inside the workshops, feeling the heat from a slow-burning fire, inhaling the subtle scent of carbon and something slightly earthy. You are witnessing the almost mystical process of ink-making alchemy. This wasn't industrial production. It was a craft, often passed down through families, imbued with a blend of practical knowledge and, perhaps, a touch of personal flair. Think of it as a low-tech, high-skill kitchen. The chefs were the ink makers, and their recipes, while fundamentally simple, allowed for endless variation and perfection. Their goal: to transform raw, inert materials into a fluid that would flow effortlessly from a reed pen and leave a permanent, rich mark on papyrus or parchment. The core ingredient, as you recall, was carbon black, that fine, sooty powder. This lamp black, brought in from distant kilns, would be the starting point, but it couldn't just be mixed with water. If you've ever tried to mix soot with water, you know it forms clumpy, uncooperative blobs. This is where the alchemy truly began. The carbon particles needed to be thoroughly dispersed, almost atomized. Within the liquid, the first step often involved an incredibly fine grinding process. Imagine using a stone mortar and pestle, or perhaps even a flat stone and a rolling pin-like tool, to repeatedly crush and rub the lamp black. This wasn't just about making it finer. It was about breaking up any aggregates and ensuring uniform particle size. This stage could last for hours, even days, as the ink maker patiently worked the powder, sometimes even sifting it through fine cloths to remove any larger, gritty impurities. A gritty ink would ruin a pen and tear precious parchment. Once the carbon was exquisitely fine, the gum arabic entered the scene. The raw gum, once collected and dried into hard, amber-like tears or nuggets, needed to be prepared. Often, it would be soaked in water for an extended period, perhaps overnight, allowing it to dissolve slowly and thoroughly, forming a thick, viscous solution. This gum solution was the crucial binder. It acted like a glue, holding the carbon particles in suspension while wet, and then, as the water evaporated, binding them firmly to the writing surface. Without it, the ink would simply brush off once dry, leaving behind a faint, impermanent stain. Now, for the mixing. This was the heart of the alchemy. The finely ground carbon black would be slowly, carefully added to the gum arabic solution. But it wasn't just a simple stirring. Ink makers would often grind the mixture together on a smooth, non-porous surface, like a slab of stone or a ceramic plate, using a muller, a flat-bottomed grinding tool. This repetitive, circular motion further dispersed the carbon particles within the gum solution, ensuring that each tiny speck was coated and suspended. Think of it like making a very smooth, very black paint. This process, known as levigation, was paramount for producing an ink that flowed smoothly and didn't clog the delicate reed pens. The right consistency was key. Too much water, and the ink would be too pale and bleed. Too little, and it would be thick, clumpy, and prone to cracking when dry. The master ink makers knew by feel, by the drag of the muller, by the sheen of the mixture, when it was just right. It was an intuitive knowledge, built on years of practice and observation. Beyond the basic carbon and gum, other ingredients might be added for various reasons. A tiny amount of honey or a sugary syrup could be incorporated. This wasn't for sweetness, but as a humectant, something that helps the ink retain a little moisture, preventing it from drying too quickly in the hot desert air while writing, and also preventing it from becoming brittle and flaking off the parchment over time. A little bile, sometimes from an ox, might also be added. This sounds like a quirky tidbit, doesn't it? Bile, with its surfactants, actually helped reduce the surface tension of the ink, allowing it to flow more smoothly from the pen and adhere better to the slightly oily surface of parchment. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a flow improver, turning a good ink into a truly exceptional one. For red inks, the process was similar, but instead of carbon, finely ground ochre or other red pigments would be mixed with gum arabic. These mineral-based inks often had a slightly different texture and required different grinding techniques to ensure they were smooth enough for writing. The vibrant colors we see in some illuminated manuscripts are a testament to the skill of these pigment grinders and ink makers. A mainstream historical fact: the principles of ink making in Timbuktu, particularly the use of carbon black and gum arabic, were remarkably consistent with those used across the Islamic world and even in parts of medieval Europe. This wasn't an isolated innovation. It was part of a shared tradition of knowledge production, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of material science centuries before the term existed. The universality of these methods underscores their effectiveness and reliability. Historians still argue whether the specific recipes and techniques used by individual ink-making families in Timbuktu were closely guarded secrets, passed down only through lineage, or if there was a more open exchange of knowledge among artisans. Was there a master ink makers guild, or was it a more informal network of shared expertise? This debate touches on the nature of artisanal knowledge transfer. In pre-industrial societies, perhaps some secret ingredients were indeed family heirlooms, making certain ink batches famously superior. The finished ink would then be poured into small, often decorative inkwells, ready for the scribes. Sometimes it would be allowed to dry into small cakes or sticks, which could then be easily transported and reconstituted with water when needed, like those ancient Chinese ink sticks. This also allowed for easier storage and reduced the risk of spillage during transport. Imagine buying your ink in solid form, chipping off a bit, and grinding it with water every time you wanted to write. That's dedication. The alchemy wasn't just in the mixing, it was also in the quality control. A good ink maker would test their batches rigorously. Does it flow smoothly? Does it smudge easily? Does it fade over time? Is the color consistently rich and deep? This attention to detail ensured that the precious manuscripts of Timbuktu, written on expensive parchment, would stand the test of time, their words preserved for centuries. As you observe this meticulous process, you gain a deeper appreciation for every line of text in those ancient manuscripts. Each stroke of the pen, each beautifully rendered letter, represents not just the scribe's effort, but also the painstaking work of the inkmaker, transforming raw earth and tree sap into the very medium of knowledge. This process, so vital and so well established, seemed immutable, eternal. The flow of carbon, gum, and water seemed as constant as the flow of the Niger itself. But the meticulous balance of this alchemy, reliant on a steady stream of ingredients, was about to be profoundly tested. The whispers, faint at first, about difficulties in obtaining certain raw materials would soon grow louder, threatening to unravel this delicate, ancient art. The ink, once a seemingly infinite resource, was about to become the most precious commodity of all. The gentle rhythm of life in Timbuktu, defined by the rise and fall of the sun and the ceaseless scratch of pens, was built on an assumption that the flow of essential resources, like the Niger itself, would never cease. But now you begin to feel a subtle shift, a barely perceptible tremor in the meticulously balanced system. You're witnessing the first unsettling signs as the great ink shortage looms. It didn't happen overnight, not with a dramatic flourish or a sudden, catastrophic event. Instead, it began as a whisper, a minor inconvenience that slowly, insidiously, grew into a pervasive anxiety. Think of it like a distant rumble of thunder on a seemingly clear day. You hear it, dismiss it, but then it returns, closer this time, and a shadow crosses the sun. The first signs might have been noticed by the most discerning of scribes. Perhaps their ink wasn't quite as rich black as usual. Maybe it needed more grinding, more stirring, to achieve the desired consistency. A batch of gum Arabic might arrive, but it's cloudier, less pure, requiring extra purification steps. Or the price of the essential carbon black starts to creep up in the market, a subtle indicator of dwindling supplies or increased difficulty in sourcing. These were not immediate crises, merely minor irritations, dismissed as seasonal fluctuations, or the usual challenges of long-distance trade. Just a bad batch, a scribe might grumble, dipping their pen into a slightly paler mixture. But these isolated incidents began to coalesce. Caravans, once arriving with predictable regularity, started to be delayed, not for days, but for weeks. Rumors would circulate in the bustling market squares. A particularly harsh sandstorm had disrupted a route. Or, more ominously, political instability in a distant land was making travel perilous. Remember those long, dangerous journeys to collect gum Arabic or produce soot. Any disruption along that intricate supply chain would have immediate repercussions in Timbuktu. A caravan lost to bandits, a key oasis drying up, a change in leadership in a remote territory impacting local trade agreements. Any one of these could ripple through the system. You start to hear new complaints from the ink makers. The acacia trees, perhaps overtapped in some regions due to increased demand, might be yielding less gum. Or the communities responsible for producing lamp black might be facing their own challenges, drought affecting their water supply, or a shift in local priorities away from soot production. The sheer volume of demand from Timbuktu's burgeoning intellectual output was relentless, a silent drain on distant resources. It was a classic case of demand slowly outstripping supply, exacerbated by external factors. The scholars and scribes, initially oblivious to the complexities of ink production, would begin to feel the pinch directly. The cost of a small pot of prepared ink would rise noticeably. What once seemed an affordable, if not cheap, commodity was now becoming a significant expense. This forced difficult choices. Do you pay more for ink, or do you cut back on other expenses? For a professional scribe whose livelihood depended on constant output, this was a direct hit to their income. For a student, it might mean having to save for weeks just to afford enough ink for their studies. Think of the psychological impact. For generations, the act of writing was secure, foundational. The ink was simply there. Now, that certainty was eroding. Imagine trying to concentrate on a complex theological text, or painstakingly copying a medical manuscript, knowing that every single dip of your pen uses up a precious, finite resource that is becoming harder and harder to replace. It adds a layer of quiet desperation to every stroke. Every mistake becomes even more agonizing. One mainstream historical fact that lends context to this scenario: the trans-Saharan trade routes, while incredibly robust for centuries, were always vulnerable to shifts in geopolitical power, environmental changes, and economic competition. The decline of certain empires, or the rise of new ones, could directly impact the safety and efficiency of these routes. A period of prolonged drought could devastate grazing lands for camels and reduce the water available at oases, making journeys far more hazardous and expensive. These broader historical forces were the silent architects of Timbuktu's looming crisis. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some parts of the world facing ink scarcity, scribes were known to try to extract every last drop from their inkwells, sometimes even adding a little spit or weak tea, hoping to stretch the usable life of the ink. You can imagine the grim determination on a scribe's face as they tried this, probably with limited success, only making the ink thinner and more prone to fading. The desperate measures start with small, almost imperceptible adjustments. Historians still argue whether the underlying causes of Timbuktu's decline were primarily environmental, like desertification impacting acacia tree growth, or water sources, or predominantly political and economic, such as the shift in trade routes following the European discovery of sea routes to Asia, or regional conflicts. The ink crisis, while specific, could be seen as a microcosm of these broader forces at play, showing how even a seemingly minor commodity can be profoundly affected by larger historical currents. As the ink continued to thin, literally and figuratively, the ripple effect would spread beyond the individual scribes. Libraries, both public and private, would face unprecedented challenges. How do you maintain a collection, let alone expand it, when the very means of its creation is threatened? The acquisition of new manuscripts, a cornerstone of Timbuktu's intellectual vitality, would slow dramatically. Why commission a copy if the ink for it costs more than the parchment? The atmosphere in the city would slowly change. The vibrant intellectual debates might still occur, but beneath them, a current of anxiety would flow. The sense of boundless knowledge, of an ever-expanding intellectual universe, would begin to contract. Conversations would inevitably turn to the ink problem. Have you heard if the caravan from Tagaza made it through? Is there any good gum Arabic to be found? My last pot of ink is almost gone, and the price, it's outrageous. This wasn't just about writing, it was about memory, about the future. For a city that prided itself on its vast libraries, on its meticulous record-keeping of everything from legal precedents to medical remedies, the threat of running out of ink was existential. It wasn't just the practical impediment to scholarship. It was a psychological blow, a threat to their identity as a city of knowledge. The silence that would eventually descend would begin not with a lack of things to say, but with the inability to say them, to record them, to transmit them to future generations. The shadow of the looming ink shortage was falling, and the long, slow process of adapting, improvising, and ultimately facing the consequences was about to begin. The whispers, once faint and easily dismissed, have grown into a murmur, then a palpable unease that threads its way through the very fabric of Timbuktu. You can feel the shift in the air, a subtle tension replacing the confident hum of intellectual activity. This is the stage where whispers and rumors spread, transforming a logistical problem into a societal tremor. Imagine yourself in the bustling main square, surrounded by the scent of spices, leather, and desert dust. The usual haggling over salt and gold still takes place, but now, among the merchant chatter, you catch snippets of concerned conversation. Have you seen the price of black pigment? It's doubled this month. One merchant might lament to another, his voice low, and the gum Arabic. The last caravan was barely half its usual load, and the quality, subhanallah, it was deplorable. These weren't just the gripes of businessmen. They were ripples spreading outwards from the core problem. So immersed in their texts, found themselves increasingly preoccupied with the dwindling resource. In the madrasas, where students once copied texts with confident strokes, hesitation crept in. A master might advise his students to write smaller, to be more economical with every drop. The idea of precious ink was no longer a poetic flourish. It was a stark reality. Think about the psychological impact of this growing scarcity. For centuries, the ability to record knowledge was a given. It was foundational to their society, their faith, their economy. Now, that foundation felt shaky. People started sharing anecdotes, some true, some exaggerated, all contributing to the growing anxiety. I heard that the last shipment of pine soot was seized by bandits far to the north. They say the acacia trees near Tagaza are dying off from the drought. My cousin, who works for the Sultan's chief scribe, told me they're rationing ink, even for official documents. The desert, once a source of wealth and connection, now felt like a vast, isolating barrier. The intellectual elite, those very scholars and imams who oversaw Timbuktu's libraries and schools, would certainly have been among the first to grasp the gravity of the situation. Their entire life's work, the preservation and expansion of knowledge, was directly threatened. Debates would shift from theological intricacies to practical logistics. What alternatives can we find? Is there a forgotten source for carbon? Can we distill pigments from local plants? These weren't idle questions. They were desperate inquiries, driven by a looming crisis. You might see scribes congregating outside inkmakers' shops, anxiously inquiring about new stock. The inkmakers themselves, usually quiet artisans, would be under immense pressure. They, more than anyone, knew the difficulties firsthand. They were the ones receiving the increasingly poor quality raw materials, the ones having to stretch their existing supplies, and the ones facing frustrated customers. Their reputation, once built on the richness and flow of their ink, was now determined by their ability to produce any ink at all. One mainstream historical fact to consider: periods of localized resource scarcity were not uncommon throughout history, often exacerbated by a combination of environmental factors like drought or disease affecting key plants, animals, and geopolitical instability. Conflicts disrupting trade routes or supply areas. What makes Timbuktu's ink crisis unique is the profound impact it had on an intellectual economy, where the resource wasn't food or metal, but the very medium of thought and learning. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some desperate individuals might have tried to recycle old manuscripts, not by erasing them entirely, but by soaking pages in water to try and leach out enough residual ink to be reused, or perhaps just to collect the fibers for rudimentary new paper. Imagine the painstaking, likely futile, effort to collect enough usable pigment from dissolved ancient texts. It speaks to a level of desperation that is almost heartbreaking. Historians still argue whether the initial response to the ink shortage was proactive and coordinated among Timbuktu's leadership, or if it was largely a decentralized individual struggle for survival by scribes and scholars. Was there a grand council meeting to address the ink problem? Or did each household and madrasa simply try to cope on its own until the crisis became undeniable? This debate highlights the challenges of centralized governance in large, complex, pre-modern cities facing unprecedented challenges. The very concept of intellectual property would have been subtly affected. If copying a text became incredibly expensive and difficult, the value of an existing, already copied manuscript would skyrocket. Lending manuscripts out might become riskier, and perhaps there was an increased emphasis on reading texts aloud and memorizing them rather than relying solely on written copies. The oral tradition, always strong in West African scholarship, would have gained renewed importance as a fallback for knowledge transmission. The impact wouldn't just be felt in the libraries and markets. Consider the ripple effect on other trades. The people who made reed pens, the binders who crafted the leather covers for books, the parchment makers, all would see their demand diminish as the fundamental act of writing became constrained. It was like a slow-motion unraveling of the city's intellectual ecosystem. The social dynamics might have shifted too. Those families or individuals who still possessed significant reserves of ink, or who knew of a secret, dwindling source for raw materials, would gain considerable power and influence. It could have led to a new form of ink aristocracy, where access to the means of knowledge production became a marker of status and wealth. Imagine a black market for gum Arabic, or a whispered trade in pure, deep carbon black dot as you listen to the escalating concerns and witness the mounting anxiety. You realize this isn't just about ink. It's about a city's soul, its identity, its entire way of life being challenged. The pride in their vast libraries, the prestige of their scholars, the very notion of Timbuktu as a beacon of learning, all of it was now shadowed by the grim prospect of silent pens and empty inkwells. The ink problem was no longer just a rumor. It was a pressing, undeniable reality demanding action, even if those actions would be born of desperation. The stage was set for a series of increasingly drastic measures as the city grappled with the terrifying prospect of a world without ink. The time for whispers has passed. The rising tide of anxiety, once confined to hushed conversations, now pushes the inhabitants of Timbuktu into action, however desperate or ingenious. You can almost feel the collective clenching of jaws, the determination mixed with a growing sense of panic as the city embarks on desperate measures taken to preserve its intellectual lifeblood. The first, most immediate response was conservation. Every drop of ink became precious. Scribes began to write in smaller, more compressed scripts, squeezing as many words as possible onto each precious sheet of parchment or papyrus. Margins, once generous, became razor-thin. Headings and decorative elements that previously would have been rendered in vibrant red ink were now often done in plain black or omitted entirely. Imagine trying to read an ancient text where the scribe has tried to cram an entire chapter onto a single page. It would be an eye-strain nightmare, but a necessary evil. Ink makers, under immense pressure, became masters of stretching resources. They would dilute existing ink, adding more water, often at the expense of richness and permanence. This meant the ink, once a deep, velvety black, became a faded gray, prone to smudging and less resistant to the passage of time. They might also experiment with alternative binders, perhaps using more readily available plant saps or less pure forms of gum, knowing full well these would yield inferior results. It was a compromise, a sacrifice of quality for the sake of mere legibility. The city saw a surge in the recycling of existing materials, old, less important documents or scrolls that were no longer actively consulted might have been carefully, meticulously washed to try and reclaim the parchment or papyrus. This was an arduous process, fraught with the risk of destroying the material. But the desperation was such that every faint possibility was explored. Imagine the historical loss if a forgotten legal document from a century past was sacrificed to make way for a contemporary treatise simply because there was no new parchment. Another measure involved a renewed emphasis on oral tradition. While Timbuktu was famous for its written culture, West Africa has always had a rich history of oral storytelling and knowledge transmission. As writing became difficult, scholars likely leaned more heavily on memorization and verbal teaching. Public recitations and debates would have become even more central to intellectual life, with students committing entire texts to memory, becoming living libraries themselves. This was a valuable fallback, but it lacked the permanence and widespread accessibility of written texts. It's one thing to hear a lecture. It's another entirely to have a physical copy you can revisit and pore over, perhaps. One of the most visible signs of desperation was the emergence of impromptu, even comical, attempts at homemade ink substitutes. People would experiment with anything that could stain: crushed berries, plant juices, the char from cooking fires, mixed with whatever sticky substance they could find. A fringe historical tidbit to consider: some records suggest attempts to use extracts from certain local barks, or even dried animal blood as a pigment mixed with binders. The results, however, were often disastrous, faded, foul-smelling, or simply unusable for serious scholarship. Imagine a scholar presenting a beautifully recited poem, only for the accompanying manuscript to be written in a ghastly, purplish, rapidly fading concoction. It adds a touch of tragic absurdity to the situation. The search for new sources of raw materials intensified. Expeditions might have been dispatched further into the desert or deeper into the Sahel, risking unknown dangers in search of new acacia groves or unexplored mineral deposits that could yield pigments. These expeditions would have been costly and dangerous, often yielding little in return. But the need was so great that no option seemed too far-fetched. One mainstream historical fact that puts this desperation into context throughout history. Societies have resorted to extreme measures when facing resource scarcity. During sieges, for example, besieged cities would often eat rats, burn furniture for fuel, or melt down precious metals for currency or weaponry. Timbuktu's response, though intellectual rather than military, fits this pattern of intense resourcefulness. Under duress, the stakes, for them, were just as high as any military conflict, the survival of their knowledge. Historians still argue whether the desperate measures taken by the people of Timbuktu were successful in significantly mitigating the ink shortage in the short term, or if they merely delayed the inevitable. Did these improvisations truly keep scholarship alive, or did they simply provide a temporary palliative while the larger systemic issues continued to fester? This debate often centers on how quickly the city's intellectual output declined in the years following the onset of the crisis. The emotional toll on the scribes themselves would have been immense. Their craft, once a source of pride and purpose, became a daily struggle against vanishing supplies. The joy of creating beautiful manuscripts would have been replaced by the anxiety of conservation. Every dip of the pen would have been accompanied by a silent calculation: is this word truly necessary? Can I make this letter slightly smaller? It would have been soul-crushing for those dedicated to the meticulous art of calligraphy. For the students, the learning process was fundamentally altered. Copying texts was a cornerstone of their education. With limited ink, their practical training would have been severely hampered. Perhaps they spent more time listening, reciting, and debating rather than practicing their penmanship. Imagine trying to learn to write when ink is rationed like water in a drought. The value of existing manuscripts would have skyrocketed. Owning a fully inked, well-preserved manuscript would have been a mark of immense wealth and foresight. Libraries would have become even more fiercely protected, their contents seen not just as knowledge, but as tangible, irreplaceable assets. It wouldn't be surprising if a black market emerged for genuinely high-quality ink, traded quietly and at exorbitant prices. The city, once vibrant with the intellectual hum, would have taken on a different character. A sense of quiet resignation might have settled over the madrasas. The debates might have continued, but the tangible output, the beautiful, enduring record of those debates, would have slowed to a trickle. The irony would have been palpable. A city famed for its books, slowly, painstakingly running out of the very means to make them. These desperate measures, born of ingenuity and necessity, were a valiant fight against an invisible enemy. But the question remained: how long could ingenuity hold out against a fundamental lack of resources? And what would happen when even these desperate attempts proved insufficient? The answer, as the crisis deepened, would become tragically clear. The frantic, often desperate, attempts to conserve ink and find substitutes ultimately led to a grim realization. If you couldn't write with traditional ink, you had to find other ways to record or convey information. You are now witnessing the poignant, sometimes futile, attempts at alternative writing surfaces. This wasn't about innovation born of progress, but of necessity born of lack. Imagine a scholar, accustomed to the smooth glide of a reed pen on fine parchment, now staring at a crude piece of slate or a rough, sun-baked clay tablet. The shift from the elegant permanence of ink to these temporary or less suitable mediums was a stark symbol of the crisis. It was like swapping a high-definition screen for a blurry, flickering black-and-white television. The information might still be there, but the quality and accessibility are fundamentally compromised. One of the most immediate and widespread alternatives was the use of wooden slates or boards. These were already common in Timbuktu and across West Africa for elementary education, or for drafting texts before committing them to expensive parchment. Students would write on them with charcoal, chalk, or even a sharpened stick, and then wash the surface clean for reuse. As the ink crisis deepened, these slates would have been pressed into service for more complex tasks. A scholar might meticulously draft an entire chapter on a series of slates, memorizing it as they went, before attempting to transfer only the most critical parts to permanent record with their dwindling ink supply. It's like composing an entire novel on a series of whiteboards, knowing you can only print one short story. However, the limitations were profound. Wooden slates were bulky, not easily transported in large quantities, and, most critically, impermanent. A splash of water, a brush of a sleeve, and hours of work could vanish in an instant. They offered no archival value, no way to share knowledge broadly, and no means to preserve it for future generations. They were useful for immediate thought and personal learning, but utterly inadequate for a library city. Then there were clay tablets, reminiscent of the ancient Mesopotamians. Timbuktu had access to clay, and these could be inscribed with a stylus while wet, then baked or sun-dried to create a somewhat permanent record. This method, while durable, was incredibly cumbersome. Imagine a library filled not with elegant scrolls, but with thousands of heavy, brittle clay bricks. Storage would be an enormous challenge. Transportation almost impossible on a large scale, and the act of reading involved lifting and manipulating heavy objects. Furthermore, the capacity for detail was limited. The fine script of Arabic calligraphy was difficult, if not impossible, to achieve on rough clay. Another desperate attempt might have involved charcoal on almost any available surface. Walls, large, flat stones, even dried animal hides that weren't suitable for parchment preparation might have been pressed into service. This was purely for immediate, temporary recording, perhaps a merchant keeping track of inventory for a day, or a teacher outlining a lesson. But these were ephemeral, easily erased, and offered no real solution for long-term preservation. It's the equivalent of jotting notes on a napkin versus writing them in a bound journal. A mainstream historical fact. The history of writing surfaces is a testament to human ingenuity in adapting available resources. From cave walls to papyrus, clay, wax, tablets, parchment, paper, and eventually digital screens, each medium has its advantages and limitations. Timbuktu's crisis forced them backwards through this evolution, stripping away the refinements that centuries of innovation had brought. Here's a quirky tidbit. There are accounts from other historical periods of cultures using plant leaves, particularly large, sturdy palm leaves, for writing. These leaves would be dried and treated, then inscribed with a sharp stylus, sometimes with a dark pigment rubbed into the indentations for legibility. While Timbuktu wasn't a lush, tropical environment, it's plausible that some attempts were made with local, suitable plant matter. However impractical or perishable these leaf scrolls might have been. Imagine a scholar trying to keep their entire collected works from being eaten by desert insects or simply crumbling into dust. Historians still argue whether the increased reliance on non-inked surfaces significantly altered the form of scholarship in Timbuktu. Did it lead to more concise, less elaborate texts, or a greater emphasis on diagrams and visual representations that could be carved or scratched? This debate points to how a fundamental change in medium can subtly reshape intellectual output. Did the lack of ink force a kind of intellectual minimalism? The psychological toll of these alternative surfaces must have been profound. For generations, the aesthetic beauty of manuscripts was intertwined with their intellectual content. A well-written, beautifully illuminated text was a work of art and a source of pride. Now, the act of writing was reduced to crude scratching, often on impermanent materials. The loss wasn't just practical, it was a loss of elegance, of tradition, of the very craft that defined their intellectual pursuits. Consider a scholar, known for his intricate commentaries and voluminous writings, now reduced to teaching solely through oral recitation, perhaps, scratching key terms on a dusty board with a piece of charcoal. It would be a humbling, almost heartbreaking experience. The tangible legacy they hoped to leave was suddenly curtailed. The future generations they hoped to educate might only inherit fragments, orally transmitted or scratched on fragile, temporary surfaces. This shift also had economic consequences. The industries built around parchment and papyrus preparation, while still valued, would have seen their role diminish for new creations, as the bottleneck was now ink itself. The value of existing, well-inked manuscripts would soar even higher, becoming truly irreplaceable treasures. The move to alternative surfaces was a desperate stopgap, a clear indication that the traditional way of life was crumbling. It highlighted the fundamental fragility of their knowledge ecosystem. It demonstrated that even with immense intellectual prowess and a deep desire to preserve learning, the very physical means of doing so could be taken away. This inability to reliably record, to create new permanent texts, meant that Timbuktu's once boundless intellectual expansion was grinding to a halt. It was not just an ink shortage. It was, in effect, a knowledge blockade. And as this blockade tightened, the city faced an even more agonizing choice: stay and watch their intellectual heritage fade, or flee, carrying what precious fragments they could salvage. The air in Timbuktu, once thick with the scent of knowledge and the soft rustle of countless pages, now carries a different weight. The quiet, heartbreaking sound of departure, the desperate measures, the alternative surfaces, all proved to be temporary palliatives. The relentless squeeze of the ink shortage, combined with growing instability, forced a truly agonizing decision upon the city's intellectual heart. You are now witnessing the exodus of knowledge. Imagine the scholars, the imams, the families who had dedicated generations to amassing vast private libraries, some containing thousands of manuscripts. For them, these books were not mere possessions. They were extensions of their very souls, living embodiments of their faith, history, and wisdom. To leave them behind was unthinkable, but to stay meant to watch their intellectual legacy slowly, irrevocably fade, as no new ink meant no new copies, no new commentaries, no vibrant continuation of their traditions. The decision to flee wasn't sudden. It would have been preceded by long, agonizing debates, probably whispered late into the night. Families would have argued, communities would have weighed the risks. The desert, once the source of goods that fueled their intellectual life, now loomed as both a barrier and a potential escape route. The primary impetus for this exodus, beyond the ink crisis, was the growing political instability and the eventual Moroccan invasion of 1591. While the ink shortage was a slow, internal bleed, the Moroccan conquest was a brutal, external blow. The invaders were interested in gold and control, not necessarily in preserving Timbuktu's scholarly traditions. Many scholars feared their precious manuscripts would be destroyed, confiscated, or simply neglected in the ensuing chaos. The choice became stark: protect the books or lose them forever. So the scholars began to pack. But how do you pack a library? Not in suitcases. The manuscripts, often bound in leather or carefully wrapped in cloth, were heavy, bulky, and incredibly fragile. Each volume represented hundreds, even thousands, of hours of painstaking labor. Families would have chosen their most treasured, most irreplaceable texts. Imagine making that choice. Which piece of your family's intellectual heritage do you save, and which do you, heartbreakingly, leave behind to an uncertain fate? It was an impossible triage of knowledge. They bundled the manuscripts onto the backs of camels and donkeys, sometimes even carrying them themselves, strapped to their bodies under their cloaks. These weren't just a few books. It was an attempt to save an entire intellectual civilization. They moved silently, often under the cover of darkness, slipping out of the city through lesser-used gates, trying to evade any prying eyes or suspicious soldiers. The destination: remote desert, oases, isolated villages, hidden caves, anywhere they hoped to find refuge and keep their precious cargo safe. The journey itself was perilous. The Sahara was unforgiving, even for experienced travelers. Extreme heat, treacherous sandstorms, and the constant threat of thirst or bandits made every mile a struggle. Scholars, often elderly and unused to the rigors of desert travel, pushed themselves to their limits. They were literally carrying the weight of their world on their shoulders, stumbling through the dunes. Many undoubtedly perished along the way, taking their knowledge and their precious cargo with them into the vast, silent sands. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the scale of this effort: it's estimated that thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of manuscripts were smuggled out of Timbuktu during this period. This wasn't just a few individuals. It was a widespread, desperate, and incredibly brave endeavor by an entire intellectual community. The act of hiding and preserving these manuscripts became a defining characteristic of Timbuktu's legacy. Here's a quirky tidbit. To protect the manuscripts from sand, moisture, and insects during their perilous journeys, some scholars reportedly wrapped them not just in cloth and leather, but sometimes even in animal bladders, or carefully prepared oiled hides, creating a kind of rudimentary waterproof and insect-proof casing. Imagine the lengths they went to, knowing that every precaution might mean the difference between preservation and irreversible decay. Historians still argue whether the Moroccan invasion was the sole catalyst for the large-scale exodus of manuscripts, or if the long-term impacts of the ink shortage and other environmental pressures had already initiated a gradual dispersal of scholars and their libraries prior to the military conflict. Was the invasion merely the final push, or had the foundations of Timbuktu's scholarly life already been subtly crumbling? This debate examines the complex interplay of internal and external pressures on a civilization. The psychological burden of this flight must have been immense. These were individuals deeply rooted in their city, their communities, their traditions. To leave it all behind, to become a refugee, however noble the cause, would have been devastating. They were custodians of knowledge, forced to become its itinerant protectors. Their homes, their teaching posts, their familiar surroundings were gone, replaced by the uncertainty of the desert. The immediate impact on Timbuktu was profound. The city, once teeming with intellectual activity, would have fallen silent. The madrasas, once vibrant with students and teachers, would have emptied. The inkmakers and scribes, those who remained, would have found themselves with no one to supply and no materials to use, even if they did. The very soul of the city was being packed onto camelback and dispersed into the vast, indifferent desert. This exodus was not just a physical movement of books. It was a desperate attempt to save an entire intellectual tradition from extinction. The manuscripts, once housed in grand libraries, were now hidden in secret chambers, buried in the sand, or tucked away in the most remote, unassuming homes. They became living fossils, waiting for a time when they could be rediscovered and their wisdom once again shared. The stories of individual scholars smuggling out their family's heritage are tales of extraordinary courage and dedication. Imagine a wizened old scholar, his eyes dim from years of reading by lamplight, clutching a single, priceless volume as he trudges across the dunes, knowing that the survival of centuries of thought depends on his frail footsteps. Their sacrifice was immense, their determination unwavering, and so the great libraries of Timbuktu, once so proudly displayed, vanished from public view. They became a secret, whispered legacy, scattered and hidden, waiting for a future that might remember their worth. The city itself remained, but its intellectual heart had been torn out, dispersed across the desert, a silent testament to the fragility of knowledge when the means to produce and protect it are lost. The ink shortage, combined with the shifting sands of political power, had forced Timbuktu's scholars to become nomads, carrying their written heritage not on shelves, but on their backs into an uncertain wilderness. The forced exodus of Timbuktu's scholars and their precious manuscripts was not an isolated event. Its tremors reverberated far beyond the dusty streets of the city. You are now observing the broader consequences, how the humble ink crisis and the ensuing intellectual diaspora had a ripple effect, impacting ink's geopolitical impact. The inability to write, to record, to communicate efficiently proved to have far-reaching implications for trade, diplomacy, and the very fabric of regional power. Consider, first, the direct economic fallout. Timbuktu, at its zenith, was a nexus of wealth While gold and salt were primary commodities, the intellectual industry was also a significant economic driver. The scribes, ink makers, parchment preparers, bookbinders, and the merchants who traded in these materials all contributed to a thriving local economy. As the ink supply dwindled and scholars fled, this entire sector collapsed. Artisans lost their livelihoods. Merchants who specialized in scholarly materials saw their trade vanish. This economic downturn wouldn't have been confined to Timbuktu. It would have impacted the communities in the Sahel who supplied gum arabic, the distant regions providing carbon soot, and the caravan traders whose routes once hummed with the transport of these goods. The economic slowdown would have been a felt reality across a wide geographic swath, beyond the immediate economic impact. Think about the effect on diplomacy and administration. Written documents were crucial for formalizing treaties, issuing royal decrees, recording legal judgments, and conducting diplomatic correspondence. A king's word was often solidified. When the means to produce these documents becomes scarce, the entire machinery of governance slows down. Imagine a ruler trying to administer a vast empire without the ability to issue clear written instructions to distant provinces. Messages might have to be transmitted orally, increasing the risk of misinterpretation or outright fabrication. Official records would become sparse, leading to disputes over land, lineage, or taxes. This breakdown in written communication could have led to increased regional instability. Without clear written agreements, trust between different polities might erode. Boundary disputes, once settled by referring to written treaties, might now devolve into armed conflict. A mainstream historical fact that illustrates this point: the Moroccan invasion of 1591, which was a major catalyst for the manuscript exodus, certainly exacerbated the ink crisis. But the prior weakening of Timbuktu's intellectual and administrative capacity due to resource constraints might have made the city more vulnerable in the first place. A state that cannot effectively document its own laws, treaties, and historical precedents is a state whose authority is slowly undermined. Consider the impact on trade beyond just intellectual goods. Contracts, bills of sale, promissory notes, all relied on written agreements. When ink becomes scarce, conducting large-scale trade becomes far more complex and risky. Merchants might be forced to rely solely on oral agreements, which are much harder to enforce if disputes arise. This could lead to a decline in trust, an increase in fraud, and a general cooling of commercial activity. The very mechanisms that facilitated Timbuktu's legendary wealth were now under threat due to something as seemingly minor as a lack of black liquid. Here's a quirky tidbit. It's not inconceivable that in some desperate local areas where the ink shortage was particularly acute, unique forms of notarization might have emerged to compensate for the lack of formal written contracts. Perhaps specific oral rituals or the exchange of unusual tokens gained heightened legal significance to ensure agreements were honored, filling the void left by formal written documentation. Imagine needing to exchange a specific type of rare pebble to validate a land deal because you couldn't write out the deed. Historians still argue whether the long-term decline of trans-Saharan trade was more influenced by the rise of European maritime trade routes, which bypassed the Sahara entirely, or by internal factors. such as regional conflicts and resource scarcities, like the ink crisis. The Timbuktu scenario suggests that even seemingly localized resource issues could contribute to a broader decline, indirectly impacting geopolitical shifts by weakening a crucial node in the trade network. The loss of written records also meant a loss of historical memory and strategic intelligence. Empires rely on documented histories to understand precedents, learn from past mistakes, and plan for the future. Without the ability to reliably record current events or to consult detailed historical archives, rulers and advisors would have been operating with less information, potentially leading to poorer decision-making. Imagine trying to run a country if your entire national archive was suddenly inaccessible or incomplete. Furthermore, the dispersal of scholars and their knowledge had a complex geopolitical impact. While it saved many manuscripts, it also scattered the intellectual capital that had been concentrated in Timbuktu. Some scholars might have found new patrons in other cities or regions, potentially enriching those areas. But the synergistic effect of having so many brilliant minds in one place, debating and collaborating, would have been lost. It was a diffusion of knowledge, but at a tremendous cost to the intellectual vibrancy of Timbuktu itself. The city, once a magnet for intellectual talent from across the Islamic world, gradually lost its allure. Its reputation as a scholarly haven was intrinsically linked to its libraries and its ability to produce new texts without ink, and with the constant threat of instability. Its intellectual beacon dimmed, and scholars looked elsewhere for opportunities. This intellectual migration would have shifted the balance of learning and influence within the broader Islamic world, potentially strengthening other centers of scholarship while diminishing Timbuktu's once unrivaled standing. In essence, the ink crisis was a silent siege. It didn't involve catapults or armies, but it slowly choked the life out of Timbuktu's administrative and intellectual functions. The inability to write wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fundamental impediment to the functioning of a complex society. It undermined governance, complicated commerce, and ultimately contributed to the city's broader decline as a regional power. The humble inkwell, it turned out, was far more crucial to geopolitical stability than anyone could have imagined. Its emptiness left a void that even the greatest minds could not fill, signaling a profound shift in power and influence across the West African landscape. The once vibrant hum of intellectual activity in Timbuktu, a symphony of scratching pens and murmured recitations, gradually faded. The bustling workshops of inkmakers grew quiet. The vibrant discussions in the madrasas became hushed, and the constant flow of scholars and students dwindled. You are now experiencing a city silenced, not by a sudden catastrophic event, but by the slow, inexorable erosion of its very essence. Imagine standing in the central market square, where once the air was thick with the scent of spices, the shouts of merchants, and the rhythmic beat of a scribe's work. There is now a noticeable quiet. The stalls that once displayed fresh batches of papyrus or beautifully bound manuscripts are empty, or repurposed for other, less intellectual goods. The silence of peace, but the silence of absence, of something profound having been lost. The visible signs of the silence would have been everywhere. The doors of once renowned ink-making families might be shuttered, their tools put away, perhaps, rusting. The communal grinding stones where carbon black and gum Arabic were painstakingly prepared now sit idle, covered in dust. The familiar sight of a scribe hunched over a manuscript, meticulously copying, becomes rarer and rarer. Those who remain might be elderly, clinging to their craft with dwindling supplies, or working on commission for only the wealthiest patrons. The grand libraries, once the pride of the city, still stand, their mud-brick walls silently witnessing the change. But inside, the vibrant activity has ceased. No new scrolls are being added. No new commentaries are being copied. The quiet is broken only by the occasional rustle of a librarian's robes, tending to the existing, now utterly irreplaceable, collection. These libraries, once dynamic centers of creation, become static archives, guardians of a past that can no longer be actively expanded. It's like a massive, beautiful power plant, still physically present, but with its generators silent, the power flowing nowhere. The madrasas, the educational institutions that were the heart of Timbuktu's intellectual life, also feel the impact keenly. While some oral teaching undoubtedly continued, the cornerstone of their pedagogical method, the copying and study of written texts, was severely hampered. How do you train a new generation of scholars when the very act of reproducing knowledge is almost impossible? Fewer students would enroll, drawn away by the grim reality that a scholarly life, once a prestigious path, was now economically precarious and intellectually stifled. The laughter of young students, the serious murmur of debate would lessen, replaced by an echoing emptiness. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this decline: following the Moroccan invasion in 1591, Timbuktu's status as a major intellectual and commercial hub suffered a prolonged decline. While the ink crisis was an internal factor, the external political and military disruptions certainly hastened the silencing of the city. The combined pressures created an environment where the previously thriving intellectual ecosystem simply could not sustain itself. Here's a quirky tidbit without fresh ink. The practice of talik, or suspending students, written work often a board or a piece of parchment, from the ceiling of the mosque or madrasa for public review and correction, would have gradually faded. The sight of these hanging lessons, once common, would have become a rare, almost nostalgic glimpse of a bygone era. Imagine a classroom where no one can hang up their homework anymore. Historians still argue whether the silencing of Timbuktu was a complete and irreversible intellectual collapse, or if pockets of scholarship continued to exist, perhaps in secret or in more decentralized forms, adapting to the new realities. While the grand public intellectual life certainly waned, it's plausible that dedicated families continued to preserve and transmit knowledge in quiet, hidden ways, waiting for a better time. This debate touches on the resilience of intellectual traditions, even in the face of profound adversity. The cultural impact of this silence was immense. For centuries, Timbuktu's identity was intrinsically linked to its scholarship. It was the pearl of the desert, a city where knowledge shone brightest. As the ink ran out and the ability to produce new books ceased, a part of that identity was lost. The city became a shadow of its former self, its reputation as a global intellectual center slowly diminishing in the broader Islamic world. Absence of new scholarship meant that Timbuktu, once at the cutting edge of various fields, began to fall behind. Unable to contribute to the ongoing intellectual conversations of the time, the societal fabric itself would have changed. Families whose prestige was linked to their scholarly lineage or their vast private libraries would have seen their status challenged. The emphasis shifted from intellectual capital to other forms of wealth or power. The very purpose of education would have been questioned if the tangible output, the books, could no longer be produced. This silence was not necessarily absolute. Life, in some form, always continues, but the character of life in Timbuktu had irrevocably changed. The vibrant intellectual energy, the pursuit of new knowledge, the meticulous preservation of old, these defining features were now severely diminished. The constant, quiet scratch of the reed pen, which symbolized Timbuktu's tireless pursuit of knowledge, had ceased. It was replaced by an eerie quiet, therefore becomes one of a city struggling to hold on to its heritage, its past glories contrasting sharply with its present struggles. The ink crisis, seemingly minor in the grand scheme of empires and battles, had profoundly reshaped the daily lives of its people, altered its economic landscape, and, most tragically, stifled its intellectual voice. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a void where knowledge once thrived, a stark reminder of how deeply intertwined human civilization is with the humble, yet essential, tools of communication and record-keeping. And this silence carried with it a weighty question. What knowledge was truly lost in this quiet decline, and what might the world have missed because the scribes of Timbuktu simply ran out of ink? The silence that fell over Timbuktu was not merely an absence of sound. It was the echoing void left by centuries of unrecorded thought, unwritten discoveries, and stories untold. You are now contemplating the legacy of loss, the profound and immeasurable impact of an intellectual city that could no longer put pen to parchment. This isn't just about physical books, it's about the very fabric of human knowledge, frayed and torn by the inability to record. Consider the sheer volume of potential knowledge that was never created. Imagine the scholars who, inspired by new ideas or observations, conceived of groundbreaking theories in astronomy or mathematics. Without ink, those ideas remained confined to their minds, perhaps discussed orally, but never formalized, never widely disseminated, never preserved for posterity. How many cures for diseases? How many architectural innovations? How many legal precedents? Or how many profound philosophical insights simply vanished with the passing of a single, unrecorded generation? It's a sobering thought. A library not built, a chapter never written, a brilliant idea that died with its thinker because there was no medium to capture it. The loss wasn't just in new creations. It was also in the fragility of existing knowledge. While many manuscripts were heroically smuggled out and hidden, countless others were not. They might have been left behind to decay, to be eaten by insects, damaged by humidity, or simply lost during periods of instability. Even those that survived in hiding were in a precarious state. Without the ability to make new copies, the existing ones slowly deteriorated. Each torn page, each faded line of text represented a tiny erosion of the collective memory. It's like watching a precious family photograph slowly fade into obscurity, with no way to make a duplicate dot. Think about the disciplines most affected. History, for example, relies entirely on written records. Without the ability to record current events, the narrative of Timbuktu itself and the broader region became fragmented. Future historians would have gaping holes in their understanding, relying on fragmented oral accounts or archaeological finds. Law and jurisprudence would suffer as well. Precise legal rulings and their precedents are essential for a stable justice system. When these cannot be reliably recorded, the rule of law itself can weaken. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates the problem of lost knowledge: the so-called Dark Ages in Europe, while a complex historical period, were characterized in part by a significant loss of classical texts and a decline in literacy, particularly after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This meant that much ancient Greek and Roman knowledge was lost to Europe for centuries, only to be rediscovered later, often through Arabic translations preserved in places like Timbuktu. The ink crisis in Timbuktu presented a similar, though localized, risk of intellectual regression. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. It's said that some desperate scribes or scholars, unable to find ink, resorted to reading by touch on ancient wax tablets, which allowed for temporary inscription. While not a permanent medium, it highlights the desperate lengths people went to simply interact with a writing surface, even if it produced no lasting record. It's like typing furiously on a keyboard with the screen off and no save function. A futile gesture, but born of a deep-seated need to engage with the act of writing. Historians still argue whether the loss of Timbuktu's intellectual output significantly altered the trajectory of knowledge development in other parts of the world, particularly in the Islamic world, or even Europe. Did the interruption of scholarly exchange from Timbuktu create a measurable deficit, or were other centers of learning able to compensate? This debate speaks to the interconnectedness of global scholarship and the unique contributions of specific cultural hubs. The impact also extends to the loss of specific local knowledge. Timbuktu's scholars weren't just transcribing universal Islamic texts. They were also documenting local histories, ethnographies, medical practices unique to their environment, and detailed observations of the specific stars visible from the Sahara. This rich tapestry of local wisdom, which might never have been recorded elsewhere, faced an immediate and profound threat of extinction. The world lost not just Arabic translations of Greek philosophers, but unique insights into West African societies, ecology, and culture. The psychological burden on those who witnessed this loss must have been immense. To see one's life's work, one's cultural heritage, slowly disappear due to a lack of a basic commodity, it's a form of collective trauma. The feeling of helplessness, of watching knowledge slip through one's fingers like sand, would have been agonizing. The legacy of loss, then, is also a legacy of unfulfilled potential, of silenced voices, and of a profound emptiness where intellectual vibrancy once thrived. Even the oral traditions, which initially offered a lifeline, could not fully compensate. Oral transmission, while powerful, is prone to distortion, selective memory, and the inevitable loss of detail over generations. It lacks the precision and immutability of a meticulously copied written text. So, even the saved knowledge, passed down verbally, might have subtly changed, diminished, or become less accessible over time. The tragedy of the Timbuktu ink shortage is a potent reminder of the fragility of knowledge itself. It underscores how dependent even the most profound intellectual achievements are on the seemingly mundane tools of their creation. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that for all our technological advancements, our current digital age, the very act of preserving information is still reliant on complex infrastructures and readily available resources. The silence that descended upon Timbuktu was a heavy cloak, concealing not just the city's past glory, but also the countless futures that were never written. It serves as a stark historical lesson. The tools of knowledge are not passive instruments. They are active agents in its creation and preservation. When they falter, the intellectual landscape itself can wither, leaving behind a haunting legacy of what might have been forever unrecorded. From the quiet despair of a silenced city, we now shift our gaze, fast-forwarding through centuries of dust and neglect to a glimmer of hope. You are witnessing rediscovery and reflection, the slow, painstaking process by which the world began to understand, acknowledge, and ultimately attempt to reclaim the lost intellectual legacy of Timbuktu. This isn't a story of immediate triumph, but one of persistent effort, archaeological detective work, and a profound appreciation for what was nearly lost. For centuries after its decline, Timbuktu remained largely a mythical place in the European imagination, a fabled city of gold in the heart of Africa. European explorers who eventually reached it in the 19th century were often disappointed, finding a city that was a shadow of its former glory, its grand libraries and bustling intellectual life largely hidden or long gone. But the whispers of its scholarly past persisted. Local families, often in secret, continued to guard their ancestral manuscripts, passing them down through generations, often without even fully understanding their contents, simply knowing they were precious heirlooms. The systematic rediscovery began slowly in the 20th century, but truly gained momentum in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Scholars and institutions, both African and international, began to realize the immense historical and intellectual treasure that lay hidden in Timbuktu and its surrounding regions. These weren't just a few dusty old books. These were hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, many still in the possession of private families, tucked away in chests, buried in the sand, or stored in unassuming mud-brick houses. Imagine the thrill of an archivist discovering a centuries-old astronomical treatise in a forgotten corner of an attic, or a medical text tucked away in a wall cavity. It's like finding a lost continent of knowledge. The process of manuscript recovery and preservation has been monumental. It involves delicate negotiation with families who, for generations, have been the custodians of these texts. Trust needs to be built, and assurances given that the manuscripts will be cared for and accessible. Then comes the painstaking work of conservation. These manuscripts have survived centuries of harsh desert conditions, often without proper storage. They are fragile, brittle, and susceptible to further decay from light, humidity, and insects. Specialists are needed to painstakingly clean, repair, and digitize them. This involves delicate brushes, specialized glues, and higher resolution cameras. A far cry from the reed pens and carbon ink of their creation. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this rediscovery: the Mama Haidara Memorial Library, and the Ahmed Baba Institute, IHERIAB, in Timbuktu, are two of the most significant institutions leading the charge in manuscript preservation and study. They house hundreds of thousands of these texts, working tirelessly to conserve, catalog, and digitize them, making them accessible to scholars worldwide. This is a monumental effort to reclaim a lost intellectual heritage. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of the family libraries were so well hidden that they were often concealed behind false walls or buried beneath the floors of homes, passed down as closely guarded secrets. The sheer ingenuity of these ancient data protection methods, often driven by necessity and fear of confiscation, is remarkable. Imagine your grandmother's secret stash of cookies being actually priceless historical documents. Historians still argue whether the process of digitizing these manuscripts is truly enough to prevent future loss, or if the physical conservation of the original artifacts should remain the primary focus. Is a digital copy a perfect substitute, or does something fundamental about the tactile, physical object get lost in translation? This debate touches on the very nature of preservation in the digital age, a dilemma faced by museums and archives worldwide. The rediscovery of these manuscripts has prompted a profound reflection on Timbuktu's place in global history. They challenge the outdated Eurocentric view that Africa had no written intellectual tradition or significant scholarly centers. These texts reveal a rich tapestry of thought in various fields: mathematics and astronomy, manuscripts containing advanced calculations, astrological charts, and detailed observations of celestial bodies, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of these sciences. Medicine, treatises on anatomy, herbal remedies, surgical procedures, and diagnostic methods that predate or parallel contemporary European knowledge. Law and jurisprudence, extensive commentaries on Islamic law, legal opinions, and judicial precedents that shaped societies across West Africa. History and genealogies, detailed chronicles of empires, biographies of rulers and scholars, and intricate family genealogies, providing invaluable primary sources for understanding West African history. Literature and poetry, collections of proverbs, epic poems, and philosophical treatises that showcase the rich literary traditions of the region. These texts are forcing a revaluation of historical narratives, demonstrating the interconnectedness of global scholarship and the significant contributions of African civilizations. They are a powerful counter-narrative to colonial-era prejudices and underscore the universal human drive to seek, record, and transmit knowledge. The reflection also extends to the very factors that led to the decline, the story of the ink shortage. While specific, serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of intellectual progress. It highlights how seemingly mundane resource dependencies can have catastrophic consequences for complex societies. It forces us to consider our own vulnerabilities in the digital age. What happens if the energy grids fail, or the rare earth minerals needed for our devices become scarce? The lessons from Timbuktu are timeless and resonate even in our world. The work of rediscovery and preservation is ongoing. It's a race against time, as manuscripts continue to face threats from environmental degradation and, tragically, from conflict and instability, as seen during recent events in Mali. the irony is not lost. The very region that preserved these texts for centuries now faces new threats to their survival, necessitating even more urgent international efforts. As you reflect on this monumental effort, you realize that the story of Timbuktu's manuscripts is not just about ancient history. It's about the resilience of knowledge itself. It's about the enduring human spirit that values ideas so highly that it would risk everything to preserve them. The ink might have run out, the pens might have fallen silent, but the words, hidden for centuries, are slowly, meticulously being brought back into the light, and in their rediscovery, they speak volumes about a past that demands our attention, offering lessons for our present and warnings for our future. You've traveled through time, from the first smoky experiments with soot to the painstaking efforts of modern conservationists. You've witnessed Timbuktu's zenith and its quiet decline, the bustling markets, and the silent libraries. Now, as the journey nears its end, we turn our gaze from the historical to the enduring, contemplating the unwritten future. This is about the ongoing importance of ink, even in our dazzlingly digital age, and the profound, persistent fragility of knowledge itself. Think about your own life, right now, in Bobo Dioulasso, or wherever you are listening. How often do you truly put pen to paper? Perhaps a quick note, a signature, or a grocery list. For many, the act of writing by hand is becoming a niche activity, almost an anachronism in a world dominated by screens, keyboards, and digital files. We type, we swipe, we voice record. Information feels boundless, instantly accessible, infinitely reproducible. We carry libraries in our pockets, capable of generating words at the speed of thought. The idea of running out of ink seems ludicrous, a relic of a bygone era. But is it? The story of Timbuktu's ink shortage is a profound historical mirror. It reminds us that every form of knowledge preservation, every medium of communication, relies on a complex chain of resources and infrastructure. Our digital world, for all its seeming intangibility, is built on a foundation of very physical components, rare earth minerals mined from the ground, vast data centers consuming enormous amounts of energy and water, complex global networks that can be disrupted by natural disasters or geopolitical conflict. What happens if the power grid fails for an extended period? What if the supply chains for microchips collapse? What if a solar flare wipes out satellite communications? The ink of our digital age might be electricity, raw materials for hardware, or network stability. And these too are finite and vulnerable. The lesson of Timbuktu isn't just about a historical curiosity. It's a timeless, cautionary tale about the fragility of knowledge. We often take for granted the permanence of our records, whether written or digital. But permanence is an illusion, always dependent on the continued availability of resources, the stability of social structures, and the conscious effort of preservation. Those Timbuktu scribes, meticulously grinding their soot and gum, understood this intuitively. They knew that every stroke was an act of defiance against entropy, a battle to make knowledge last. Do we, in our effortless digital creation, have that same profound appreciation for the precariousness of our information? Consider the continued relevance of physical ink. Despite the digital revolution, physical writing persists. Artists still use ink for drawings. Calligraphers create stunning works of art Even your official documents often require a wet signature in ink. There's a tangibility, a direct connection between hand and thought that digital input doesn't quite replicate. Physical ink creates an original, a unique artifact that exists in the real world, outside of servers and cloud storage. It's still used for permanence, for documents that must endure for centuries, like legal deeds or historical archives. Think about the Library of Congress. They still acquire and preserve physical books, knowing the vulnerabilities of purely digital preservation over long time frames. One mainstream historical fact relevant to this reflection: the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, while making knowledge production vastly more efficient, did not eliminate the need for ink. In fact, it dramatically increased the demand for it, as well as for paper. However, it decentralized the risk of a regional ink crisis by establishing multiple sources of production and broader distribution networks. Our digital age has similarly democratized access to information, but has concentrated the physical infrastructure in new, different ways. Here's a quirky tidbit. The ink in your modern ballpoint pen, while synthetic, still needs to flow smoothly and adhere well, just like ancient ink. Chemical engineers in ink companies spend countless hours perfecting formulations, battling issues like smudging, fading, and clogging. Modern versions of the same problems that plagued Timbuktu's ink makers. It's a continuous, often unseen, battle against the same fundamental principles of material science. Historians and futurists still argue whether our current digital methods of preservation are truly more secure and long-lasting than ancient physical methods, given the rapid obsolescence of digital formats, hardware, and the energy demands of maintaining digital archives. While a single fire can destroy a library of physical books, a single cyber attack or systemic energy failure could potentially wipe out vastly more digital data. This is the great unwritten question of our future. What will be our ink shortage, and how will we cope with it? The concept of the unwritten future also applies to the knowledge we are not currently prioritizing. Just as Timbuktu's ink crisis may have led to a loss of unique local wisdom, what are we neglecting to record today? Are we too focused on short-term digital trends, letting valuable, nuanced human experiences and indigenous knowledge slip away because they don't fit neatly into a digital format or get enough likes? The lessons from Timbuktu urge us to diversify our methods of knowledge capture, to value not just the quantity of information, but its quality, its longevity, and its breadth. The story of the Timbuktu scribes and their vanishing ink is a poignant reminder that knowledge is a living thing, dynamic and fragile. It requires constant tending, conscious preservation, and an appreciation for the mundane resources that make its creation possible. It challenges us to look beyond the immediate convenience of our technology and consider the deeper vulnerabilities. The scribes of Timbuktu dedicated their lives to ensuring that the wisdom of their ancestors would endure. They fought against a scarcity that seems alien to us, yet their struggle offers a timeless mirror to our own potential fragilities. So, as you drift off tonight, let the image of a single Timbuktu scribe, pen poised over parchment, remind you of the profound human desire to record, to learn, and to share. Let the thought of their struggle be a gentle nudge to appreciate the seemingly endless flow of information we experience daily, but also to recognize its underlying dependencies. The future is unwritten, but its quality, its depth, and its very existence depend on how wisely we manage the ink of our own time. The soft rustle of ancient scrolls fades, replaced by the gentle hum of your fan. The distant murmurs of the night. The desert sands sleep under a blanket of stars, just as they did for those vigilant scribes in Timbuktu, dreaming of ink and endless knowledge. Let the weight of history gently settle around you, wrapping you in its quiet calm. You've journeyed through time, witnessed triumphs and struggles, and now your mind is full, yet your body grows heavy. Allow yourself to sink deeper into your bed, feeling the comfort and peace of this moment. The story is complete, the lessons absorbed. Rest. Now, truly rest, as the wisdom of the past becomes the quiet whisper of your dreams.